welcome. Welcome to Canada's Fair Share, a summit on global climate equity. We're so thrilled to have this kicked off and for it to be underway. We opened the summit about an hour ago and talked about how this summit, the purpose is for us to build a critical internationalism in our climate movement in Canada, recognizing that our local and regional struggles and national struggles as well and movements and campaigns are incomplete without a critical internationalist lens and without true international solidarity. And grounding ourselves in the reality of internationalism and critical international issues like we're doing in the summit, I think is so important because it helps us recognize that our struggles are very similar and very fractal. The same patterns of occupation of land, driving a capitalist financial system that underlies and drives the climate crisis. It's the same story that happens in communities all over the world. And by that constant re-education and learning that we do in spaces like this, we enrich and build our climate movement to be more powerful than it is if we only focus on the local. And so this summit will aim to make connections between our climate movement here and what we're trying to do in Canada, and how Canada is showing up in the rest of the world, what our role in the international community is, and how we can push our governments to have a stronger and more progressive role in the global community. It's been done before. We've had a strong internationalism in Canada before. We've had strong international solidarity movements here before, and it's time for us to build those once again. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to introduce our speakers because we have the most incredible lineup of speakers for all of us here today. And I think we should get started with hearing from them. So this is the session on climate finance. Before we start, I'd love to remind folks of our community guidelines for engaging in these conversations. I'm just going to put those in the chat. And we will have our speakers speak for an hour. We're going to hear from Carola Mejía, Ceecee Holz, and Rajinder Deol. And then we're going to have an hour of participatory interactive workshop time in which we'll get a chance to really dig into the ideas, make the connections, talk to each other. That's how we build our politics together, is through that conversation, interaction, disagreement, working with the ideas. So we hope that folks will be able to stay for the whole time. I know it's a lot of Zoom, but it's a special occasion. So I think we'll come out better from this. This is just the start of this work that will continue to build in the year to come and in the years to come. So this panel is being recorded, and that will be used for internal purposes, and we'll also be posting this panel on the website as well. Thanks to the partners who made the summit happen. My colleague Doug has just put those in the chat. And we're going to get started. So first, that's it. First, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Carola Mejía. Carola is a Bolivian economist with a master's degree in economics of development and a specialty in sustainable development and environment from the Institute of Social Studies in Holland. She has more than 15 years of experience as an advisor and consultant to public, private, and international cooperation organizations, providing technical support to different environmental projects and working on issues related to climate change, sustainable development, climate finance, and climate justice. She worked as a climate finance analyst for almost 3 years in the Latin American Network for Economic and Social Justice, and this year, she's coordinator of the area of climate justice, transitions, and the Amazon of that organization. Please give a very warm virtual welcome to Carola.
Thank you so much, Anjali. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks to the organizers of this summit. It is very interesting to start talking about these issues that are so important, especially considering that we are so close to COP29 and we need to be prepared and strategize among all the groups. So I will start with my presentation. to explain a little bit more about the tensions in the climate finance negotiations. I don't know if all the people that is here knows about climate finance, but what I can say is that after 30 years, there's not an agreed definition on climate finance, and that makes things difficult. And of course, it is not so transparent, and there is a lot of this. There is no trust between global North and global South countries. But there are very important articles that we need to also know when we try to understand the negotiations that are going on. But first, for the people that is new to this topic of climate finance, we can understand climate finance as the amount of money that needs to go to mitigation and adaptation actions. Mitigation understood as the absorption or reduction of CO2 emissions, and adaptation, of course, it's going to all those actions that are helping us to be more resilient to this new context that we're living, and we're facing the impacts of the climate emergency. But I would like to mention two articles that are very important and are part of the Paris Agreement. Article 2.2 mentions that the agreement must be implemented considering equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities, considering different national circumstances. And Article 9.1 says that developed countries must financially support less developed countries for the implementation of mitigation and adaptation measures. So these two articles have climate justice in their heart. They are based on this principle that this problem has not been created equally. There are differentiated responsibilities among countries, and this needs to be considered. And it's going to be very clear when I show this images and this information. According to a report of Jason Hickel, global North countries are responsible of 92% of excess greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And we can clearly see in this map, this is the historical responsibility regarding CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions. And the countries that are more in red are the ones that are more responsible, of course. And this image is a real image projected model by NASA, which shows clearly that the greenhouse gas emissions are concentrated in the North, because these are industrialized countries with a lot of pollution, and yeah, the historical responsibility relies on these global North countries. And there are some reports of Jason Hickel that also have a ranking of the main climate debtor countries. And we could clearly see that these 7 countries are the most polluting countries, being Canada the one in the 7th place. The first one is United States, followed by Russia, Germany, UK, Japan, France, yeah, and Canada, as I mentioned. But there is also another debt that we work and we mention a lot in the work that LATINDADD does, and is the ecological debt. It is different from the climate debt because the climate debt is more focused on how much greenhouse gas emissions these countries have historically caused. And ecological debt is more related to how many natural resources these countries have been consuming and extracting, especially from the global South, from Latin America, from Africa, especially considering this colonial history that we have. And we can clearly see that Canada is also in the 7th place in this ecological debt. And we can see China here, because China is also a big country that is also extracting a lot of resources, but it's not in the climate debtor list, because China, this estimation has considered also the population and the surface of each country. So China is not yet in the ranking. And we can see that until 2030, global South countries had a lot of needs regarding climate finance. Only to fulfill their national determined contributions, or NDCs, we need between $5.8 and $5.9 trillion, which maybe are more. This is an estimation made a few years ago. We need around 215 and $387 billion annually for adaptation, and we need around $4.3 trillion per year for clean energy. So we have a lot of needs regarding climate finance, but unfortunately, the climate finance commitments made by global North countries so far fall very short on this compared to these needs. In 2009, Global North countries committed to mobilize annually $100 billion to Global South countries. It was supposed to be until 2020. The goal was extended until 2025. But so far, the goal hasn't been fulfilled. And that is something that we need to know. It's not about only committing, but also fulfilling these commitments. The OECD report says that the Global North countries have fulfilled this commitment in 2022. But as I mentioned, there is no transparency, no agreed climate finance definition, nor one methodology to measure these flows. So there's a lot of, there's no trust between Global North and Global South countries. And we can clearly see that there is a current, there is a huge gap related to climate finance that we need to close, and we need to respond to these needs. And unfortunately, Global South countries are also facing limited fiscal budgets. We are facing a debt crisis as well. So it is very difficult for us to tackle the climate emergency with our own efforts. And it's also important to know that the unfulfilled 100 billion pledge is highly insufficient. Only 28% of these flows are for adaptation. So there's a big imbalance between mitigation and adaptation. And for us, for Global South countries, adaptation should be a priority. We are already facing the impacts of the climate emergency with a lot of vulnerable groups and communities being directly affected. And we don't have enough funding for adaptation. It is also important to let you know that 2/3 of this international public climate finance that is being mobilized is being channeled through loans, which is completely unfair. For us, it's something that needs to be changed because it's increasing our debt burden, which is already high, as I mentioned. And at the end, we are the ones paying for this climate emergency, even though we have contributed less to the problem. The other problem we see is that the mechanisms to access climate finance are usually complex. The application processes for each fund is very difficult. In English, it could take 5 years to have one project approved by the Green Climate Fund, which is the most important one. So you can imagine that it is not efficient at all. It is very difficult for our countries and for our countries to access this money. And there are very few direct access windows for non-governmental stakeholders, especially high vulnerable groups that are the ones being more affected by this emergency. And as I mentioned, since the beginning, there's no single methodology nor definition that helps with providing transparency. And we also, LATINDADD has been, and climate justice movements are also mentioning that there are a lot of false solutions being promoted also in climate finance. For example, the carbon markets that do not guarantee that the emissions are going to be reduced and in 45% until 2030. The emissions are going to keep increasing because big polluters can compensate them. And this is going to promote more injustices in the world. So it's market-based mechanisms are not the solution. And there are all other innovative sources that now are being promoted that have this same logic of mercantilizing nature. And this year is very important related to climate finance because we are in a process of setting a new climate finance goal that is going to replace the 100 billion pledge. This goal is going to be operative since 2025. It's supposed to be approved in this COP29 that we are going to have very soon in Azerbaijan. But there are a lot of questions related to this negotiation of the new goal. The process is called the new collective quantified goal, the NCQG. And we don't know exactly what the new annual goal will be, what the time frame will be, who will contribute to this goal, through what mechanisms, instruments, how will transparency be guaranteed. And there are a lot of qualitative aspects that are also being discussed. It is not only about quantitative issues, but also qualitative aspects are being raised, especially by Global South countries and civil society that have been participated in this process. I have been part of these technical expert dialogues. And yeah, we have been proposing to also contemplate these qualitative aspects related to access, to the structure of the goal. I mentioned climate finance right now is only the money going to mitigation and adaptation, but we now have loss and damage. We have a new fund for loss and damage, and we know that the needs for loss and damage are also huge. And we are discussing about this structure. Is it going to also incorporate loss and damage as a sub-goal? We are talking about the instruments. We are very, very concerned if debt instruments are also being used in this new phase of the climate finance goal. We're talking about efficiency, effectiveness, and only to mention some information about loss and damage and why it is important to considering when we're talking about fair share and reparations. Only in Latin America and the Caribbean between 2000 and 2022, there is an estimation of $124 billion of losses and damages that for sure are underestimated, because we didn't report this kind of losses before. Now we do. And there is a projected economic cost of loss and damage by 2030 alone that has been estimated to be $400 billion a year by one study. And there's another study, another report that says it could go between $290 and $580 billion only for developing countries. So you can see it adds to this huge amount of money that we need, not only to address the climate emergency, but also to recover from these losses and damages that are related to these droughts, these floodings, the lack of water we have that is affecting food security, all these forest fires that we are already experiencing in my country. We lost around 10 million hectares so far this year, only because of these fires. And I know Canada also has these problems. I was living in New York, and I remember how we received all the smoke because of these forest fires that are very difficult to control because they are exacerbated by these climate conditions. And under the negotiations of this new collective quantified goal of the climate finance goal that is going to be agreed in COP29, there are different positions, and this table can help us understand a little bit more about the different positions. Global countries are trying to align the goal to Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement that says all the flows, that says that all the financial flows should be related to a low carbon and resilient path of development. That means, in other words, that all the flows from all countries must be considered. But of course, Global South countries said, no, why are we going to change the logic? We need to align it to Article 9 as the original goal, which says that developed countries need to support developing countries in this recognition of the CBDR, the Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. Global North countries are trying to take this process to make everyone part of this contributor space. They want to have like an onion structure, which can have public money in the core, but also private investment goal, multilateral banking goal, and also they want to add to the contributor space emerging countries, for example, China, India, and this is big. There's this big discussion about how they want to increase the contributor space. But Global South countries says no. The process of setting a new goal should be only about talking about replacing the goal for a more ambitious goal, but we shouldn't be talking about increasing the contributor space. The contribution should mainly come from public sources of rich countries in accordance with the principle of CBDR, Common but Differentiated Responsibilities. Global North countries are trying to clearly dilute their historical responsibility, and they are also promoting these innovative mechanisms, debt swaps, market mechanisms. I've heard the United States talking about, for example, adaptation markets, like carbon markets. They want to create markets for everything because they say there is not enough public money to close this financial gap. But we know the public money is going into the wars, it's going into fossil fuel subsidies, it's going into extractive industries that are sectors that are harming people. And there's no political will to take these flows to tackle the emergency. So now they are creating these debt for nature and climate swaps, carbon markets, green bonds, and others that are being promoted under this innovative name. And global South countries are saying, no, we cannot, the climate finance should not add to the debt burden. Climate finance should not create more debt. So we need more grants and not more loans. And we need highly concessional financing. And that is something important to let you know that all the loans that we are receiving are not concessional, not most of them. Especially if you may think, for example, that multilateral development banks that are channeling climate finance should have high concessional loans. They have not. 91% of these multilateral climate finance is our loans, and more than 70% of those are non-concessional. That means they have market rates, not good conditions. And global South countries are also talking, and also civil society and part of these kind of movements that are also requesting debt relief. Okay, if the gap is so huge and you don't have the political will to rechannel this money that is going to the war, that is going to fossil fuel subsidies, why don't we cancel the debts of countries that are highly indebted, that are highly vulnerable to climate change, that could free up some fiscal resources that can help them tackle the emergency. And there are other things that are being negotiated. For example, global North countries want a long-term time frame of 10 years. Global South countries want a time frame of 5 years with updates of the goal according to the needs, because the needs are going to be increasing if real solutions are not implemented. And global North countries says loss and damage should not be part of this new goal. And global South countries says, yes, it should be a sub-goal. It is something that we need a reparation for, and it's something that is taking a lot of money and is creating more debt also in our countries, and only the economic losses. So what to expect about this process? We expect a provision of international public climate finance in the form of grants, mostly, at the core of the NCQG. We want the historical responsibility of global North countries not to be diluted about this process. And we need to fight for this goal to be consistent with Article 9. Article 2.1c is very important, but it's part of another discussion. Shouldn't be part of this process. This NCQG process should guarantee the provision of high quality, new, public, and additional debt-free, gender-responsive climate finance grants that are free from economic conditions. It should not result in further indebtedness from climate finance in the Global South, and thus should follow the principle of CBDR and adopt a climate justice perspective. We want fair financing. I will repeat it again, more public grants, especially for adaptation and loss and damage, which are a priority for us. We want debt relief for highly indebted countries, debt cancellation in the event of extreme climate events, and other mechanisms that are not being discussed right now. We want more direct access windows for vulnerable communities and more agile processes. It is not good that we need to wait 5 years for a project to be approved under a very difficult process. It is an obligation of the countries of the Global North, Canada is one of them, to repair this climate debt to the countries of the South, which are really currently most affected by the climate emergency. Northern countries must meet this goal of mobilizing 100 billion annually, which should increase considering the needs that we have now. This new goal must present improvements both in terms of quantity and quality. The resources for adaptations must be doubled, and that is something that I remember from Glasgow. It's a call for developed countries, but it hasn't been fulfilled as well. We need agile public financing and direct access, especially for the groups that are being most affected. And we need the climate finance that must be predictable, adequate, and additional to financing commitments. For example, the official development assistance, the ODA commitments are one thing, and climate finance should be additional to this ODA. And unfortunately, considering there is no an agreed methodology nor a clear and agreed climate finance definition, sometimes it is double counted. And it is necessary to establish a single methodology and definition to provide this to guarantee transparency. And I will end with this. False solutions such as carbon markets should not be promoted. Military spending and fossil fuel subsidies must be redirected to climate action. That is public money that is harming and is not helping. We need also a reform in the international financial architecture, which is urgent, so we can put life and not profit in the center of the decisions. And we need to promote also global economic governance reforms. For example, in the way that the IMF, the World Bank are governed. I don't know if that's right, because right now the board of members of these institutions are made of these climate finance debtors, these climate debtors and ecological debtors that, of course, don't have any political will to change the things. And they are going to promote more of these false solutions and more loans, because loans are a neo-colonial way to have conditions over our countries. And that is something that needs to be recognized. LATINDADD is also promoting new issuances of special drawing rights for the climate agenda. And there are new distribution criteria that prioritizes climate vulnerability and needs. SDRs, special drawing rights, are difficult to explain, but I will try to do it in just 1 minute. It is like extra money that is created under the IMF, only if the members of the board agree on this. It has been done before. After the pandemic, $650 billion have been created, distributed among countries. Global North countries receive two-thirds. Global South countries receive only 1/3 because it responds to the quota that they have in the board. But for us, for Global South countries, that was very important because it's money that it does not create debt. It is money that has not conditionalities. You don't have to be part of a program to receive this money. So why don't we think about more allocations of special drawing rights with a different distribution criteria to close this financial gap? It is something that is not being discussed in the NCQG process. LATINDADD is trying to bring this kind of options to the negotiators so they can push for them. And there are also other different mechanisms like green taxes on fossil fuel corporations that are making millions of profits every year by killing people, by polluting the world so much, because they are also responsible. And we need political will to promote these systemic transformations and real solutions to reduce the climate, greenhouse gas emissions and tackle the climate emergency. In the short time, we have to do it. And we need to understand that it's not a matter of solidarity between the North and the South. It's really about climate justice, differentiated responsibilities, and reparations. So I will finish there. I'm sorry if I took longer of the time.
Oh, thank you so much, Carola. That was such an amazing overview of the issues. I think you've also outlined, you've done so much of the work that we are going to go into the workshop and do after this, which is identifying what are the specific demands and what are the specific policy levers that we need to change. Thank you so much. We had some great questions in the Q&A. Carola, if you want to take a look in the Q&A box, you can also answer some of those questions yourself. Thank you, Ceecee, for providing some answers as well. Incredible. Thank you so much. And there's some thanks coming in the chat as well. So please stick around, continue asking questions for Carola as well. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ceecee Holz. So Ceecee is the Senior Research Associate at the Climate Equity Reference Project and the Executive Director of the Climate Equity Reference Project Canada. Ceecee is also an affiliated researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute and co-teaches the core course of Carleton University's Master's Specialization on Climate Change. Their field of research is international and Canadian climate change politics, with an overall research agenda focused on the role of equity and fairness as enablers of ambitious domestic and international action on addressing climate change. So Ceecee has been leading some folks in Canada through a process to determine Canada's fair share, the title of this whole summit when it comes to climate finance. So I'm going to let them take it away. Thanks, Ceecee, for being here. Please feel free to use the Q&A function, everyone, as a reminder.
Okay. Okay, so hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. I'll try to be fast-ish. And Carola's presentation is helpful because some of the things that I was going to say have already been said. So that's great. And also, like, we'll have a whole workshop so we can dive deeper into some of these things at a later stage. So very quickly, what I'm going to do in the next, I think I have 20 minutes. I try to do it in 18, is to go to introduce our approach to thinking about fair shares of climate action, and our approach in this case is the climate equity reference frameworks. And I'll do that on the example of mitigation because it's a little bit more straightforward, and then apply the same logic, show how the same logic can be applied to climate finance, specifically of climate finance for mitigation, as well as adaptation and loss of damage. So that's a full program. So let's get in there. As Anjali mentioned, in Climate Action Network Canada and some allies, we have gone, I think you mentioned that, maybe not. We have gone through a process of kind of a deliberative, discursive process of defining how we understand collectively as the members of Climate Action Network what fairness means. And we talked about these different things that are listed here and that I will go through in a second. I will skip all these things in the interest of time. Generally speaking, and that's why I really loved the introduction of talking on the framing of the overall summit here, that critical internationalism or internationalism in general is like this crucial central element. Our starting point is the realization that the transition has to be fair to succeed at all. And at the very minimum, so that's ideally, at the very minimum, it has to be seen as sufficiently fair to succeed. And this is both like morally right, but it's also instrumentally necessary because, let's face it, no one wants to be, the sucker and take on an unfair, undue burden. And so having the impression that everyone is doing their fair share is just like a necessary condition for the transition to work at all. So for doing this, we need like a fair sharing of effort between countries and within countries, and fairly sharing effort, climate effort between countries means necessarily international cooperation. And so in our approach, we start from the UN Climate Convention and its equity principles. And we have already seen some of them on Carola's slides, especially at the bottom, the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. But there are also some other ones, for example, the precautionary principle and the principle that parties, like countries, have the right to promote sustainable development. So those are the in our view, the equity principles of the UN Climate Convention. And just a reminder, every single country in the world has ratified that convention. So this is, at least in theory, are the equity principles that every country agrees should govern our collective planetary response to the climate crisis. And so what we do at the Climate Equity Reference Project is we take those principles there in the gray boxes at the top and turn them into sort of like conceptual indicators of adequacy, development need, and adaptation need, as well as historic responsibility and capability. And then we think about quantitative or quantifiable indicator that express those things. And then we can do some cool math, and we can then calculate the responsibility and capability index at the bottom left and combine it with the total effort that is required, for example, for mitigation or for financing adaptation in developing countries and so on. And we combine that to get a fair share of that total effort for every country. And one thing that sets our approach apart from others, and which I think makes it particularly useful for progressive actors like progressive movements and so on, is that we don't just look at the differences between countries, but we also look very importantly at differences within countries, and specifically the differences between poor and rich and those in the middle within countries. And so when we think about a country's capacity, for example, to address climate change, we think about it in terms of what is the excess capacity that it has to act on climate change that goes beyond the needs of the poorest to live decent lives that are that are sort of like free from the negative impacts of extreme poverty or of poverty, right? And so we treat the incomes of the poorest differently than those of the rich and those that are sort of leading middle class-ish lives when we calculate capacity of a country to act. And the same with historical responsibility for emissions. In this case, we think that the survival emissions of the poorest should be considered differently than the luxury emissions or the emissions associated with luxury consumption of the richest. For example, to fly a spaceship around the Earth just for fun because they have the money to do that. And so they should be treated differently. I think that's morally like pretty straightforward, and our model does that. And also these core principles of historical responsibility and capability also happens to be quite aligned with what we teach our children when we tell them about what like things that are fair, right? For example, historical responsibility is kind of a fancy word to saying, well, if you spill like some orange juice, you go and clean it up, right? So like if you make a mess, you contribute to cleaning it up more than others who did not make the mess. And the same with if you have more, in order to achieve a common goal, then you contribute more, right? So that's the ideas here. So again, applying this to mitigation specifically, we can look at like a time series of emissions, right? So we have in a baseline scenario where no one is doing any climate action, any mitigation actions to reduce emissions, the emissions would continue to trend up as they have done for, I don't know, the last 150 years. However, we know from the IPCC reports and so on that they need to trend downward instead if we want to keep within the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. And so what we have between those things is the mitigation effort, the global mitigation effort that needs to be undertaken collectively to move from where we would go otherwise to where we need to go, right? So pretty straightforward. And then if we calculate based on what I explained just a minute ago, the capacity and the responsibility of all the countries in the world, then we can say, okay, like if a country has, for example, 30% of the global combined responsibility and capability or capacity, it would be fair for that country to take on 30% of this global effort. So that's the kind of the basic premise of this approach. So that happens to be the case for the United States, for example, that depending on how specifically you define a capacity and responsibility, has around like a third to 45-50% sometimes of the global combined capability and responsibility, and as a result takes up about that amount of the global effort. And then you can go down the list, and notably every single country has some sort of fair share. In some cases it's so small that you can barely see it on the chart, and in others it's more substantial. And so Canada is somewhere in this dark blue wedge here as one of the other wealthy countries. And Canada's, depending on, again, how you define it, Canada's share of the global combined capability and responsibility tends to be around 3%. So between 3 and 4%, just as a little bit of a, I don't know, tidbit of information or whatever. But as I mentioned, our part of our climate equity reference framework, and that what makes it a framework is that different specific views of what's fair can be reflected in it. And that's why when we work with civil society organizations, like earlier this year with Climate Action Network Canada, we have a discursive process where we kind of tease out what the groups that are involved think is fair. And part of that is questions about responsibility. And here we conceptualize responsibility as the responsibility for historical emissions, right? And here one crucial question is, how far back do we go in time to look at historical emissions and to add up historical emissions? Some common choices or possible choices include go all the way back to 1850 when emissions really started to increase as the industrial revolution kicked off. Then another common choice is 1950, where like the great acceleration started after the Second World War, and people that are alive today still benefit from the massive expansion of fossil infrastructure that happened during that time. So we could kind of argue that since we still benefit from that now, we should be held responsible, and so on. So in each of these slices has different implications for how many of the historical emissions we ignore. Like if we do 1850, well, we capture about 95% of all global human emissions. And if we only do from 1990, for example, we ignore about half of them, right? And so on the side here, you see that also the contributions of different countries to the cumulative emissions change slowly over time, depending on what we do and how we consider this historical responsibility. And similarly, we can think about, how do we measure capability or capacity to act on climate change? And here, what I like to show is this chart. So I made that a few years ago with data from the World Income Inequality Database. No, with the World Inequality Database, which is slightly different than the other one. And it shows the global income distribution of people. So like all the people in the world are vertically ordered from the poorest to the richest. And then the income that they receive is added horizontally, right? And you can see if you add all these things up, the poorest 50% of the world, like this whole sort of like light gray-green-ish slice in the bottom, only receive about 8% of the total global income, whereas the richest 10% receive well over half, right? And so then the pie charts show you that those people live, like the distribution of these people around the world is not equal, right? So the richest people tend to live in North America, Europe, and Japan, New Zealand, Australia, whereas the poorest tend to live like not in those countries, but in India, China, the rest of the world, and so on. And in the middle is kind of in the middle, right? So if we think about capacity as the excess financial capacity that countries have after meeting the needs of the poorest, then we can see, this is probably distributed in the same way as the different pie charts here. So more of that in the north and less of that in the south. And in our normal, like in our sort of standard parameterization of our model, the threshold below which we tend to completely exempt the incomes of the poorest lies around like corresponds to about the poorest 2/3 of the world population, and is set as a level where where empirical research has shown that the intergenerational effects of extreme poverty start to disappear. So that's kind of like a very brief introduction to the framework. And then if we just apply this to mitigation and specifically to Canada, we can. So this is a chart from this report that we did with Climate Action Network Canada earlier this year, and we look at Canada's fair share, and we say, okay, we calculate that Canada's share of global responsibility and capacity is roughly 3%. It's one of the top 10 wealthiest countries, top 9 emitters of greenhouse gases historically, and even though it's only 0.5% of the global population, its combined capacity and responsibility is roughly 3%, and that's why it should take on about 3% of the global mitigation effort. And if we then plot that against Canada's emissions, then we can see, if we actually do this entire fair share, we have to do a 160% decrease of emissions below 2005 levels. And so since that is not possible, then we argue as the collective group there, that part of that has to be done domestically with emissions reduction in Canada, about 80%, and the rest has to be done by funding emission reductions in other countries. And that's where the mitigation finance piece comes in. And I'm skipping this, and then we can continue here. Now we are moving into the climate finance part, right? Because this blue slice here that is labeled international cooperation is the part of Canada's mitigation fair share that it cannot really do, within the country. We can just argue whether 80% is the right number or whether it should be 100%, but like 160 clearly is beyond what can be done in Canada. So in order to still do this international or this component of Canada's mitigation fair share, there has to be some sort of international cooperation enabling other countries to go beyond their own fair share by providing the necessary technology, finance, and other support. And so we can then calculate, and I'm going through this very quickly, if we have this blue slice, we can then look at the IPCC's reports, and some data of how much mitigation in developing countries is expected to cost along those timelines. So this is all like you can read that up in that report that we wrote up, and you end up with a annual climate finance contribution to implement this blue slice in the previous chart of about 25 billion Canadian dollars in 2025, and that increases to about 86 billion Canadian dollars by 2035, and that would be just the mitigation component, just by Canada, just to developing countries, right? And so contrast that with the number that Carola mentioned, that developing countries altogether currently, have pledged up to 2025 $100 billion per year. There's a clear disconnect between these figures, and so then we can do similar things for adaptation. So recalling that what I said earlier, that Canada's share of global responsibility and capacity is roughly 3%. But if we only look at Canada's share of the developed countries' responsibility and capability, so because we only expect developed countries to contribute to international climate finance, then it increases to roughly 4%. And we could argue, okay, that means that it should provide about 4% of adaptation finance needs. And we can then look in, there's a UN Environment Program report on adaptation, the adaptation gap report, that tells us about how much adaptation finance is needed globally, and then we can apply the 5 to 4% and the Canadian figure, and we can do something similar for loss and damage. Carola mentioned some of the same sources that I used, and then we get a total for that as well. And then we can add them all up, and we have in 2025, which is like next year, 25 billion for mitigation, 12 to 21 for adaptation, 6 to 8 for loss and damage. And then there's a fourth component that the project that I'm also involved in has been highlighting for supporting fossil fuel extraction phase out in developing countries, where Canada's share would be another 9 billion. So adding all that up, I don't know, I have to kind of squint at it, like, give or take 50 billion next year, Canadian dollars would be the fair share. Okay, 18 minutes and 45.
Oh my gosh. Big virtual applause to Dr. Ceecee Holz for that. Also, your little pop-up video is hilarious, and
I didn't see that.
we love it. Getting really innovative over here. Thank you so much, Ceecee, for that incredible, informative, concise presentation. I mean, I think many of us have asked about if the sessions were being recorded, because we will have to go through and, and sort of like re-listen to some of what you said. But really what you arrived at is this whole methodology, all of those normative and ethics-based questions lead us to this massive, massive figure that Canada owes the rest of the world approximately $50 billion a year for at least the next 10 years. And that's an almost unfathomable number. It's not a very specific or strong policy goal to push for. And so how do we break down this massive goal into an actual campaign that we can build in Canada? So thank you so much for setting up those questions for us in a good way. Please, folks, use the Q&A box to ask questions of Ceecee, Carola, and our final panelist, Raj, who I'm going to introduce now. So Raj Deol recently completed his Master of Arts in International Studies at SFU. Born in Hong Kong, of South Asian descent, and now residing on Turtle Island, he believes in the values of transnational solidarity and community as key to reimagining collective futures and actions. He just received the Simons Foundation Canada Graduate Fellowship and the Annie and Leon Josephowitz Memorial Award. And he lives out his values through his work, advancing caste and social inclusion in international development, researching gender migration discourses in Asia, and strengthening the global human rights system from backlash. Raj is also a development practitioner who's worked with the UN on gender equality, disaster resilience, and migration. Going forward, he hopes to bring people and diverse knowledge together in reshaping policy, norms, and practices. Please welcome Raj, who's going to give a little overview of his analysis of how Canada shows up in the rest of the world.
Thank you so much, Anjali. Carola and Ceecee, I really appreciate what you said because it really, my analysis really builds up on and your both's presentation. So I'm gonna just start. So together with Padma and Climate Emergency Unit, we are sort of drafting a discussion paper on what is Canada's track record on climate finance, equity, and justice. And I mean, it's to no one's surprise that they're deflecting fair shares. And so that'll be the title of our discussion paper. So today, I just want to briefly go over what is the landscape of common but differential responsibility, and where does Canada stand in terms of its climate finance, and our early analysis that shows Canada's narratives and stance on climate equity. So first of all, as both Ceecee and Carola mentioned, that this principle of common but differential responsibility and respective capacities is an anchor within the global climate governance space to center justice and equity principles. But then, however, we see that since its inception in 1992, it has been sort of contested over the last 3 decades. One of the biggest thing is that even though it is written in principle, there is a lack of universally accepted method of translating the principle into concrete actions. While CBDR is widely recognized in international agreements, there's a considerable divergence in how it should be applied, as Carola sort of mentioned in her slides, the difference between Global North and Global South. What is interesting is also we see that the power that the Global North has amassed within the space is they're trying to shift from responsibility to an emphasis on capacities in this CBDR principle. And that's why they're sort of pushing for certain countries like China and India to actually be in that onion structure that Carola mentioned. But we also see an erosion of CBDR's normative power, primarily due to the contestation of its fundamental tenets. But this is also where, how Canada shows up and what stances and positions they take sort of diminishes the power that CBDR can hold within the space. And then we can also see that the volunteer nature of contributions to climate finance mechanisms, such as the Green Climate Fund, presents another challenge to CBDR. So without mandatory contributions based on the common but differential responsibility principles, the financial support from developed countries have always been insufficient to meet the needs of vulnerable nations and the Global South nations. And all of this combined leads to limited resources, which also facilitates tensions among the Global South of who gets financial resources and how much they get. And so there is some research written that why, is there no collective unified effort from the Global South to demand equitable climate financing, is because limited resources always present tensions with certain smaller global South nations. And so this is a brief overview of the landscape. So, but then we can also see Canada's shortcomings, as this is based on Ceecee's presentation just now, that Canada has weak climate finance. And we can see in this graph that based on the disbursement that Canada has been providing since 2016 to 2023, and what is needed in terms of mitigation in 2025 based on Ceecee's calculation, is that we do have a big fair share gap, and what we're providing is not nearly enough. But there are also other shortcomings with Canada's finance that Carola has mentioned, so I'll go them. I won't spend much time on here. So we see that there's a reliance on loans over grants, and that leads to the debt crisis and heavy burdens on Global South. We see a reliance on multilateral banks in dispersing these climate finance, and we all know that the World Bank, the IMF have been structured in a way that limits the potential of progressive climate action. And it's also quite interesting of how these platforms uphold these fossil fuel subsidies, but as well try to do climate action in the same breath. So that's something we have to be mindful of on how does Canada disperse their climate finance through which platforms, and most of them are through multilateral banks. And then we can also see, as Carola mentioned as well, the lack of transparency, which we can see within Canada. There is a double counting happening. Sort of when Canada is providing climate finance, they're counting it under overseas development assistance, while they should be separate. And this obscurity sort of contributes to the lack of accountability there is. And this leads me to what were we trying to find out in our research? We know that Canada has weak climate finance, but what was missing in the research when we started doing this is a missing context. The context of why Canada's climate finance is weak, the context of how Canada acts on CBDR and climate equity. And the way we wanted to understand what Canada's stances and positions were was to take Canada at their word. So we did an analysis of 9 speeches and statements made by Canadian representatives at the climate governance platforms like COP. We also did an analysis of their 2 recent reports to the UNFCCC to really understand what is the language and what is the narrative they're using around climate equity, and what are the actions and stances they have taken. And we have supplemented these through reporting through Third World Network, but also UN documents that really show what Canada has said in those spaces. It's very hard to see what Canada is talking about and what kind of narrative they use in those climate governance spaces. So we have some reporting, but also these speeches to understand that a little bit. So what we actually found out is, this is only, let's say, for the speeches part, we see that there is no mention of CBDR at all in these speeches. There is a very vague reflection of justice, of responsibility, but we see a heavy emphasis on this idea of helping Global South, aiding Global South, supporting Global South, that this idea of benevolence that's upholded by Global North is there. So this analysis really reveals a consistent framing approach that aligns a saviorism narrative that emphasizes the voluntary support of the Global North, rather than them acknowledging that climate finance is a reparative obligation that's grounded in historical responsibility. So across all documents, keywords related to saviorism, like supporting, helping, aiding, appear frequently, underscoring Canada's portrayal of its contributions as benevolent assistance. In contrast, terms that aligned with responsibility, such as obligation, historical responsibility, reparations, are rare, and they reinforce the idea that Canada is sort of sidestepping the equity principle of CBDR. We can see that there is also a lack of mention of justice and equities or vulnerability or the idea of just transition. They appear very infrequently, and when they're presented, they're framed around this idea of a collaborative language of like partnership, but rather than of historical accountability. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, there is a minimal use of the CBDR specific terminology, and this aligns with this broader trend observed in the statements where Canada's climate finance discourse favors capacity-based contributions over responsibility-based reparation. So instead of framing the contribution as necessary to address historical emissions, Canada emphasizes on present capacities and these innovative mechanisms, as Carola was mentioning, and mobilizing private investment, that sort of distracts from the fact that they're not assuming their responsibility. So by focusing on their current capacity rather than historical duty, Canada's rhetoric appears to dilute the original intent of CBDR and shifting the narrative towards innovative and collective goals without grounding them in equity or reparative justice. And the biggest shock out of all is that there is no mention of CBDR in the two recent Canada's report to UNFCCC, and both of them are like around 500 pages long each. So in over 1,000 pages, when Canada is talking about climate action and climate finance and supporting the global South countries, there is no mention of the CBDR principle. And we see from their webpage, one of the webpages where they mentioned CBDR on their website, they said, oh, it's not legally binding. It's something that we can take on board if it's our choice, but it's not a duty that they have to uphold. Now, when we read between the lines, we see three things come up. First, based on Canada's weak climate finance and the way they talk about climate finance in the narrative and the reporting, we see that they're evading responsibility, and that's very clear. Second, what we see is that they're using this like savioristic stance and narrative within their documents and how they talk about climate finance, which really distracts from a responsibility-based approach. And finally, we see that Canada is undermining equity by not only shifting the rhetoric and narrative where they're at, but also we have supplemental data here that shows how Canada is undermining equity. So this is a reporting from the Third World Network that talks about how Canada is actually refuting this language of common but differential responsibility in actually a quite toothless document that talks about our common vision of the group of G77. And Canada supports the US in avoiding that type of language. And we see in a lot of these documents, Canada parrots the US's line quite heavily. This is another example. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child was doing this report on connecting children's right to climate change. And the UN Convention Committee really wanted to add common but differential responsibility as an aspect to that to that document. But again, Canada here refutes the committee's characterization of CBDR, saying that is not recognized in international human rights law, so we should not include it. So they're quite consistent in undermining where CBDR, the potential of CBDR. And finally, in the UN Environment Assembly, developed countries like Canada is expressing that CBDR should not be included as in the text because you are signaling out one of the many principles of the Rio Declaration where CBDR was founded, but they want to make a generic statement. So these are few examples that gives us a sneak peek to how what Canada positions and stances they are in the space. Now, I just wanted to end with what are the new narrative that we want to see, and this we'll talk about on the workshop. So instead of evading responsibility, we want to see a narrative that talks about assuming responsibility. In terms of saviorism, we want to talk about more of a solidarity approach, and undermining equity, we want to focus on enhancing equity. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Whoa. Big virtual applause and gratitude to Raj. That was fascinating. You know, I know these are early findings that are part of a broader project. Thank you so much, Raj. I think a lot of folks in the chat found it really valuable. And please keep the questions coming. We are going to transition into the workshop now. So keep all these wheels turning in your head. A major thank you to Carola Mejía, to Ceecee Holz, and to Rajinder Deol for being an absolutely brilliant panel, really top-rate panel. We are so grateful to you.